Welcome to the Worldshapers, conversations with authors about their latest books. I'm your host, Edward Willett, and this episode's guest, E.C. Hibbs, talking about The Shade Between Shadows, Nightland Quartet, Book 1. Welcome to another episode of The Worldshapers, the podcast where I talk to other authors about their latest work. My name is Edward Willett. I'm the host. I am myself an author. My latest novel was from Daw Books. It's been a while now because I'm kind of between projects. But it was a far future outer space science fiction adventure called The Tangled Stars, which features an AI-uplifted talking cat who becomes a starship captain. Yes, it is humorous. You can find that in audiobook and ebook, wherever you find audiobooks and ebooks, pretty much. So please do go check that out. The other thing I want to mention, however, is related to my publishing company, Shadowpaw Press, where I publish a lot of books in a lot of different genres. And that is a Kickstarter that's getting very close to wrapping up as this episode goes live. It will end on May the 9th, and this episode should be up on May the 5th. And it's getting close, I hope, but I really don't know because I'm recording this a little while before that. I'm looking for $12,000, and it's to promote or to support the publication of Shapers of Worlds Volume 5, which is an anthology featuring guests of this podcast from the fifth year. Science fiction and fantasy short stories by lots of great authors. It's the fifth Kickstarter I've run, and the fourth one produced this book here, Shapers of Worlds Volume 4, which came out in January of this year. As you can see, this one had Sherilyn Kenyon, Michael Brent Collins, David Boop, lots of great authors in there, and was illustrated as well by Wendy Nordell, a Calgary artist, and the new one will also be illustrated. So please, I really hope you will go over to, you can use tinyurl.com/shapersofworlds5, tinyurl.com/shapersofworlds5, and check it out, or just go to Kickstarter and put in Shapers of Worlds. You'll see all of the not podcasts, campaigns listed there. Yeah, there's lots of great backers rewards, opportunities to chat with authors, mentoring. I'm authoring a book editing package. There are signed books and lots and lots of ebooks. So please check out Shapers of Worlds Volume 5 Kickstarter. That will come out from my Shadowpaw Press. The other big news on Shadowpaw Press front is that this week, again, assuming this went up on May 5th, which if it didn't, I'm going to have to redo this introduction, so clearly it did. I'll be launching on May 7th these books. We have The Downloaded by Robert J. Sawyer. I interviewed him very early in the year. And it is the print edition of a book that is currently out as a audiobook original featuring Brendan Fraser in the cast, among other people. But on May the 7th, this releases, and there's going to be a joint launch that night in Calgary at the main branch of the Calgary Public Library. I'll be there along with Rob Sawyer, and also there will be Dr. Robert Runday, who edited this book, The Trader's Son. Dave Duncan was the late great Canadian science fiction fantasy author. Dave Duncan died in 2018. Robert Runday was his editor, and in fact he was awaiting editors on this book when he died. This is one of two new Dave Duncan books that I'll be publishing. This one is science fiction, The Trader's Son. The other one is called Corridor to Nightmare, and it'll come out later this summer. Other two recent releases I want to mention from Shadowpaw Press: The Downloaded. Oh, sorry, that's the that's the Headmasters. The Headmasters from Mark Morton, a Canadian author. This is a young adult science fiction dystopian novel set at a research facility in northern Ontario where something went horribly wrong and alien parasites came through and attached themselves to everybody. I hate it when that happens, but I do recommend the book. And I also recommend this. Oops, that's the wrong one. I also recommend this book, The Good Soldier by Nir Yaniv. I also interviewed Nir earlier this year on the podcast. The Good Soldier is a military science fiction satire. You can think of it as MASH meets Starship Troopers, as Lavi Tidhart calls it, or Catch-22 meets Starship Troopers, something along those lines. I highly recommend this one. It's very funny, very good book, and it is also available from Shadowpaw Press. Many other things coming up from Shadowpaw Press this summer, which I'll talk about as they come along. Okay, I think that covers the highlights. So let's get on to today's guest, E.C. Hibbs. And again, I'll put on my reading glasses so I can read this. E.C. Hibbs is an award-winning author and artist, often found lost in the woods or in her own imagination. Her writing has been featured in the British Fantasy Society Journal. She has provided artworks in various mediums for clients across the world. She's also a calligrapher and live storyteller with a penchant for fairy tales and legends. She adores nature, fantasy, history, and anything to do with winter. She lives with her family in Cheshire, England. There. Now let's talk to E.C. Hibbs. So, Emma, welcome to the Worldshapers.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, I always look for connections. Not a lot, because you live in England, so I have never met you. I've only been over to England once. Yeah, I've been to Europe twice, but to England itself once, and it was 1978, so it's been a while. However, we do share one thing in common, which is that your byline is E.C. Hibbs, and I have a byline as E.C. Blake. So there's a connection, which are my initials, Edward Chain. My middle name is Chain. My parents went to see the Western Shane, and they liked it, so they just changed one letter when they were having me in, made that my middle name, and I've been explaining it ever since. But E.C. So I really like that part of your byline there.
Thank you. It's good that we have something in common.
So let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. And tell me where you grew up and what you were interested in, and, how did you end up doing this crazy thing where you tell stories?
Well, I'm from Cheshire in northwest England, which is probably most famous for a certain grinning cat.
Yes.
And I've lived more or less my entire life in northwest England. And I grew up in this really small little village, and it was surrounded by woodland, and it really did feel like something out of a fairy tale when I was little. And I was also brought up on a very steady diet of books, every single kind of book. I can't remember the first time that I was reading, and when I was then turning that into writing. I was always fascinated by fairy tales, by history, just everything that was going on around me. I just wanted to soak up life, even when I was young. I just wanted to experience everything that I could. And I can't really remember when I wrote my first book. I think I must have been about 5, and it was about a dragon. That's all I remember. So obsessed with fantasy, even back then. But as I got a little older, I started branching out into longer stories. I started writing novels when I was very early into high school. I think I wrote my first novel when I was about 12 years old, and it was really bad, but I didn't care. It was the milestone that counted, the fact that I'd written my first novel. And then I went off to university, again in the same area of the world. But I did animal behaviour, and then that led on to a master's in wildlife conservation, because I was interested as I am in writing and anything to do with books. I'm also fascinated by nature and animals, and I wanted to be able to take care of them. That was what I originally thought that I would be doing. But in the end, even though I still have all those skills and I'm very very proud of them, life took me down a little bit of a different track. And I ended up, first of all, working out in Finland, which I absolutely loved, and I still consider it my second home. Absolutely beautiful part of the world. And while all this was going on, I was still writing. I tend to think of my writing now as when I was in school, it was a hobby. Now I'm very fortunate that as I've gotten older, it's turned into a job, but it doesn't feel like a job. It feels like a joy. And as much as there is a hard work involved, at this point, it almost feels like an obsessive compulsion. I just can't stop. I have to actually think to myself whenever I have a new story idea arrive. The first thing that comes into my mind is, very nice to meet you. Get to the back of the line and wait your turn. Because there's other ones that have to come ahead of you. So I was writing throughout school, throughout university, just scribbling down all of these stories. And eventually I was able to be published by a small press in the US when I was 21. So that was a really, really big milestone. They published my first 2 books. And then after that, I went independent, and I've been independent ever since. But it's been a really amazing journey, and all of the ways that life has inspired me as I was growing up, it continues to do so. I ended up writing an entire trilogy, young adult fantasy trilogy, which was essentially inspired by my times living up in Finland, bringing in all of that Nordic and Arctic mythology. And now that I'm back in the UK full time, instead of going to work with animals, I found my way into the heritage sector. So I'm now surrounded by history going back to 2000 years ago. I also am a traditional storyteller. So I'll get up in front of people and essentially tell all of the old fairy tales, which nobody tells anymore, just helps hopefully to keep them alive a little bit. And love digging into the origins of fairy tales, the history of fairy tales, bringing them to light and explaining to people where these stories have come from. And still scribbling away at my stories and entertaining my cat on the side.
Yeah, well, there's a few other connections between us along in there, because I wrote my first complete short story. I'd written other things when I was 11. Castor Glass Hypership Test Pilot, which shows you where my brain was very early on. And then I wrote novels in high school. I still have them, actually. Oh, look, it's right. It's actually right up here. Look, this is my novel from high school, The Golden Sword.
Oh, I love that.
I'd learned to type, so it's all typed up. And I was very motivated to learn to type because I wanted to write. So I was always the fastest typist in my class. And so there's some connections there for sure.
That reminds me a little of when my first novel that was originally published back in 2012. The first ever version of that, first draft of that, was actually handwritten when I was in high school because I didn't have access to a computer. So I set myself a challenge to see if I could write the entire first draft within 1 month. And I did it. So I was very proud.
Well, this started because I had a teacher, and I was going to ask if you had any teachers who, inspired you along the way on the writing side. But in this case, I definitely did, because we had a requirement to keep what was called a writing book, and you had to write a page a day. It could be anything. Some kids just copied stuff. But I started, it's dated. I still have the handwritten manuscript up here too, I think. And it's dated, so I know I started writing it when I was, I was 14. When I started writing it, and it's dated, and then it runs to the end of the school year, but it keeps going because I had written so far ahead. I'd left the daily requirement way behind me. So was there anybody like that who encouraged your writing in those early years? And did you share your writing with people when you were starting out?
I did. So when I was in high school, I really had some amazing teachers, English teachers, but also teachers in other departments, because even when I was younger, I was always doing a lot of research for my stories. And of course, when you're a youngster, your first point of call to do any of your research, aside from the library, of course, is usually your teachers. So I would be going over to, say, my geography teacher and my history teacher and absolutely grilling them about these details that I wanted to know. Not partially for my exams, but also because I really, really wanted to get this story right. And they'd sort of look at me like I had two heads for a moment, but they were really encouraging, and they did give me that information. And my English teachers, they were very enthusiastic, on the condition that I made sure I did my homework first. They were actually, I remember them saying at one point that if I ever did get published, then I would have to come back and donate a copy of my book to the library. And I'm sure that they forgot about that, but I did not. So when it did happen, I did go back to the library, and I think I was almost mobbed by the librarian because she remembered me, and she nearly rugby tackled me to the floor when she saw me.
Well, it's always nice when you can go back and sort of thank those people that helped you along the way. I was able to dedicate one of my novels to my junior high English teacher. That story, Castor Glass, because I thought everybody in science fiction and fantasy had to have weird names. That's why it was called Castor Glass. He did me the honor of treating it seriously. Like, he didn't just pat me on the head and say, "Oh, you wrote a short story." He said, "Yeah, I don't understand why your characters do this and that, and and I don't know. I've always credited that with, well, the next thing I write will be better." And I think that really helped push me along the way. And I was able to track him down. He's overseas now. and dedicate one of my novels to him and send him a copy. So that was kind of nice.
Oh, that's lovely.
Now, you mentioned Finland, and the thing that I always think of as Finland is that it was the Finnish language that inspired Tolkien when he was creating the Elvish language, and that whole sort of northern mythology was very much influential in his creation of a fantasy world. Just have your experiences in Finland and everything else. I assume that all feeds into your writing.
Oh, yes. So I'd always been fascinated with, to quote Philip Pullman, the idea of North from when I was very young. And then I got the opportunity to go out and work in Finland for what amounted to 5 winters. So I would go over in November and then I would stay until just after New Year. And it was amazing because I was living in a log cabin in the middle of the forest, 90 miles north of the Arctic Circle. And we'd go outside and there would just be some reindeer walking randomly down the road and everyone would have to stop for them.
And no sunshine during that time period to speak of.
Very little sunshine. So we weren't so far north that we had complete polar night. But when it got close to midwinter, the sun wouldn't completely break the horizon. So we had about half an hour of this beautiful blue twilight that was almost lightless. It's known as the blue hour. And it's where you have the only light comes obviously from the tiny bit of sunlight that you have, but it reflects off all of the snow, but in a way that casts no shadows. So the world turns completely blue and black. And it's very, it's quite ethereal, and it can be quite unnerving as well because the snow deadens so much noise and you really feel like time has stopped on you. And I would just walk out of the cabin sometimes during that time just to experience it, just to stand there and listen to the silence. And it was so amazing to just feel that you were so alone, but it didn't feel frightening. It felt quite comforting in a way to know that. But the amount of things that happened when I was in Finland, they're too numerous to mention. Some of them were absolutely astonishing. I'll never forget the first time I saw the Aurora Borealis for the first time. I'll also never forget the first time I got attacked by a snow ptarmigan. But yeah, the real life Angry Birds.
I didn't think of them as being something that would attack you. So.
Yes, I was in the middle of a field during the blue hour at one point, and what I can only describe as a snowball with wings came hurtling towards me out of nowhere. And it was white all over, had big fluffy feet and red eyebrows. So, of course, my first thought is, well, you're a peculiar looking thing. And then it started making a noise, which I can only describe as a broken lawnmower trying to start up. And then it leapt up onto my shoulder and started attacking my hat. So,
well, that is an unusual experience.
Yep.
Well, we should move on. Sorry, I was just going to say we should probably move on and start talking about your book, which is kind of what we're here for. And as I said, I was telling you before, I was looking at all of the books, and then I had trouble remembering the title of this one because you do have a lot out there. But this one, the new one, just came out, is The Shade Between Shadows, and it says a Nightland Quartet, book 1, so clearly there's more to come. So how about a quick synopsis without giving away anything you don't want to give away?
Okay, well, the entire Nightland Quartet is set in an alternative 1830s, and specifically begins in 1838, wherein the United Kingdom, which we would recognise as being England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, it actually contains a 5th country, Nightland, which is essentially the enchanted forest from all of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. So the entire series is what you might get if 30 plus of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales got smacked together with early Gothic literature like Jane Eyre, The Castle of Otranto, The Bride of Lammermoor, and also happened to take place in a semi-historically accurate United Kingdom. So the series primarily follows the protagonist called Beatrice. She is a mute below stairs servant. She's also neurodivergent, but that terminology isn't specifically used in the book simply because the terminology did not exist yet. Doesn't obviously negate the fact that neurodivergence and other such elements existed during this time, but if the terminology is not there to describe them in the contemporary sense, then we roll with it. And so she is discovered to be a half British, but also half-Nightlander, meaning she's got a grey. And that means that she has to be essentially deported from the British countries over the border into Nightland to serve an indenture. And while she's there, she meets a brother and sister who essentially become her found family. And she finds herself embroiled in a deep, dark mystery, which involves the very dangerous prince of Nightland. And so her endeavours to unravel that mystery and also keep herself safe and maybe try and find some freedom is what sets off the entire quartet and really gets the ball rolling with the Shade Between Shadows.
Sounds very cool. Now, what was the, and this is the question, where do you get your ideas? I know you're not supposed to ask that, but nevertheless, what was the inspiration for this? And typically, where you, as you said, story ideas come to you and have to go to the back of the line. Where do they come from? Are they just all around and they just pop up, or are there specific things that will often trigger a longing to tell a story?
Well, it's really a mixture of everything and anything. And I think a lot of writers will say it's very similar. You never really know when inspiration is going to strike. And sometimes it strikes in the most inopportune times and places. And you just have to hope that you remember it for long enough to write it down. But in terms of this one, I'd had a couple of potential ideas just floating in the background, but I knew that they weren't strong enough by themselves to warrant stories as is. I thought I need to let them stew for a little bit and find their feet, and then maybe they will find new connections and something might grow out of it. We'll see. And as I mentioned, I've always been really fascinated by fairy tales, folklore. It was one of the things which also inspired my series up in Lapland. It was that exposure to the mythology and the culture of the Arctic areas, and then that grew into a story. It was very similar to this. So even though I haven't got a drop of Australian blood in me, I'm an international member of the Australian Fairy Tale Society, which basically means a bunch of us meet up for what is for me the middle of the night, just to talk about fairy tales and be extremely nerdy and bounce off each other and sometimes share ideas, because there's a lot of authors in that circle as well. And in digging into the history of the fairy tales and seeing all of the different ways that fairy tales can connect, and there is actually an index system that folklorists use to keep track of all that, I began wondering to myself, well, what if all of these fairy tales, and all of the ways that they can come together, what if that was twisted slightly? What if the connections were found in history? What if they were found in culture? What if they were found in other kinds of literature? And it was essentially a massive explosion of intertextuality, but also told in a very grounded way through the eyes of somebody who, in a historical time period, would have been very easy to overlook. And so I began just playing with ideas and looking at all of these fairy tales and seeing all the different ways that they could intersect if you just shifted them slightly. And then the story just began to grow in front of me. And it was almost like watching a flower bloom. The closer I looked at it, the more the layers piled on, the more they managed to find new connections. And then what I eventually realized I'd done was write into the story, in essence, a fairy tale treasure hunt. So it's one of those things where you can just enjoy the story as is, as entertainment. That's obvious, that's what stories are meant to be at the end of the day. But if you are really interested in your fairy tales, if you're really interested in your history, your Gothic literature, then the more you will see if you want to look for it.
Now, you mentioned, of course, that you're involved with the heritage side of things. And there's, I noticed a term you used in the description of something about real Victorian time period, or some words like that. So we were trying to make the historical side of it very accurate as well, I presume.
Yes. And I think that also comes from the fact that I do work in the heritage sector, and I work in an extremely old building, 1,000-year-old building, which has seen every time period since then as well, which you also have to be aware of. And I think the important thing when writing historical fiction, whether it's actual historical fiction or whether it's historical fantasy, is it's important to get the details, but more than anything, it's important to get the textures right. Because it's very easy with historical periods, even when we look at them just from a learning perspective, to think that they are completely separate from us because they were so long ago. Or even if they weren't really that long ago, things could be so different back then that they can seem further away than they are, and we can detach from them very easily and forget that these people were just like us, and they were living their lives and they were getting by the best they could with the best knowledge they could. And so I think when you are doing historical fiction, it's important to obviously get it as historically accurate as you can, but not turn it into a lecture. You don't want to be spitting names and dates at your readers just for the sake of it. It all needs to have a grounding. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to the human aspect and the emotion, because no matter what time period it is or what kind of book you're reading, that's what you're going to connect with. It's the similarities between you and these people rather than the differences. So I think if you can find those details in the textures as much as in the quote unquote numerical details, that's what really helps to bring it to life.
And of course, ultimately, you are writing a fantasy novel, and you will take what liberties you need in order to tell your story, I would presume.
Exactly.
Did you have to do a lot of research specific to this tale?
Yes, I did. So what made it a little bit easier was the fact that even though it is a fantasy, it does have a lot of overlap with a real time period, and not just a loose time period. We have a specific year that it's taking place in. So I was able to go away and do an awful lot of research. The areas of the United Kingdom which actually appear in the story, even though it's through a fantasy lens, I found contemporary accounts of what they would have looked like, of what the business would have been there. One of the most amazing that I found was actually predated the time period by just a few years, was a handwritten account by Queen Victoria of a visit to one of the locations that I was writing about.
Oh.
And that was invaluable. That was amazing. I really wasn't expecting to come across that. So that was just a little treasure that I found.
She probably had really good handwriting, too.
Oh yes, she did. It was amazing. It was like, you were how old when you were writing this? She must have only been about 14 years old, and her writing is impeccable. But the rest of the research that I did, obviously a lot of reading of books, not just history books, but also books that were written during the time period, so we could get a feel for the sense of language. I've always been a big fan of Victorian literature anyway, so that wasn't too much of a chore. But I also went to specific locations, Victorian areas, living history museums, stately homes. Obviously, we've got quite a lot of those in the UK. So I went to quite a few of those, just spent days exploring the rooms. I was very lucky to grow up in an old Victorian house. I've had experience when I was younger of going through houses from the 1700s. So I was recalling my own memories of that. And I'm also a very hands-on person when it comes to research. I'll spend years researching a story if need be. And if I can get my hands dirty, I will. So with this one, I did brush my teeth with charcoal to see what that would be like.
Whoa.
And yeah. And I tried gruel. I rubbed lard on my hands for hand cream, because that's what would have been used by then if you were poor. And even so far as trying on period clothing and doing period things with my hair, just to see what you would have to do, just so it would, even if I didn't use all of these details in the book, I would be confident writing about it, and hopefully that confidence would come across in the writing voice.
What kind of planning, outlining, did you do much ahead of time? You said you kind of discovered the story and it opened up like a flower. Did you just sort of begin writing, or how much do you normally do in the way of pre-preparation?
Well, like I say, the preparation can take me several years, but because I have essentially a line of books in my head, I can work on one in one stage and then hit the pause button and go to the next one and sort of juggle them. So what I tend to do is take as long as I need to do all of my preliminary research, and I'll still do research as I'm writing the book, But I like to think the common way of thinking about it among many writers is you're either a plotter or a pantser.
Yes.
And I like to think that I'm between the two, because in the beginning,
A plantser.
A plantser. Yeah, I love that. I'm using that now.
I just encountered it. I was on a panel at a writing conference over the weekend on plotting versus pantsing, and that's what somebody called it. And I thought, yeah, that works.
That does work. I'm using that from now on. So what I try to do is, like I say, I do a lot of work in the beginning. And so you could say in that respect that I am a plotter, because I will do all the research, all the planning. I will write myself an outline. And that's mainly to figure out where the chapter breaks need to be, to make sure I have a 3-act structure in place, that it's constantly moving forward, and just make sure that I give myself essentially an anchor point. And then by the time it comes to actually write the story, it's been stewing in my head for that long, and I've got the outline in front of me that I know I can let loose a little bit. And I think all I need to do is hit these beats. If so long as I get to them in a natural way, that's the most important thing, because I think if you plot everything down to the last full stop, it leaves very little breathing room for you to actually feel the emotion and the dynamics of the story. So the way I tend to think of it is, it's not so much plotting and pantsing, it's giving yourself a map in the beginning, but then just because you have a map, it doesn't mean that you can't go off the trail and explore the sides of the road.
Yeah, I tend to, and this was when we were talking about this on the panel, I explained it, but especially because for quite a few years I've been selling from synopses. I had, I would write a 5 or 6 or 7 page synopsis, and then I would get the contract, and then I would write the book. But I usually don't look at the synopsis while I'm writing the book. It was just a way of organizing my thoughts, and then I just run with it. Unless something goes horribly wrong and I realize this is not going to get me where I need to go, then I'll sometimes go back and refer to the synopsis. So I think I'm a plantser as well.
Yeah.
Are you a fast writer once you're actually putting the words on the paper or screen?
So when I was, as I mentioned, when I was younger, the first draft of my novel, my debut novel, I tried to see if I could get it written by hand in 1 month. And I no longer do it by hand, but I can actually still write the first draft of most of my books within 1 month. It usually depends on what I've got going on outside of writing. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer, but usually I can get the first draft done within 1 to 3 months is probably my maximum. And then that is the hardest part for me. Once it's on the page, I think it's easier to work with something than nothing at all. So just get it down on the page, and then it will come alive in the edit. It will be made in the edit, but you've got to have something to edit first.
Do you have a group, do you use beta readers or anything like that? So that a group of people that might look at it before it goes to editing?
Yes. So what I tend to do, I'm my own worst critic, and I am brutal and ruthless when it comes to my own stories. If I come across a plot hole, I will interrogate it out of existence. And I will read the book until I can no longer find anything that feels like a bump in the road that's a plot hole. And only then will I pass it over to somebody else to look at. And usually I've got a really, really good group of people who give me really honest feedback, and they have eagle eyes for things like that. I've got some really kind fellow authors, bloggers who have supported me for years, and they very kindly give it a glance over before it goes through into the final stages and gets the ball rolling. But they are amazing, and I really couldn't do it without them.
Now you're publishing independently. Do you then hire an editor at some point? Or
yes.
does this look after it for you on the editing side?
So it's a little bit of both. So I usually have just like a line edit, just to make sure that everything looks good. But between myself and all of the beta readers, we usually manage to get it pretty close to where it needs to be. And like I say, I'm really, really strict with myself when it comes to story structure. I always like to make sure that things are moving, and I will bully myself into making sure that it's the best that it can be before anyone else even sees it. So between us, I think we do a pretty good job.
Sounds like you would be a good editor for somebody else potentially. Have you done any of that?
Thank you.
You haven't edited anyone else?
I haven't edited anyone else apart from just a few favors for friends and
Hmm.
short stories, but never a full length novel. But I do. Well, I have done in the past cover designs for other authors and illustrations because I've got that background in art as well. And
I was an art
it's
minor, so there's another connection.
oh, brilliant! No, I love doing all of the visual side of things. I'm also very fortunate in that I can do all of my own cover artworks and all of my own just visual. And I like the covers to be extensions of the stories themselves. And the more you look, the more you see. But maybe one day I'll get into editing full length novels. It's just we need more hours in the day.
Oh, yes, yes. I'm running a publishing company, and it's really eaten into my writing, which is concerning me. But it's just me and the cat, and I've taken on way too many projects, and I'm the editor and the publisher, and sometimes the cover designer. I don't do artwork, but I design covers from other sources. Yeah, so I know I would love to have more hours. Now, this is a quartet, which is interesting. It's not a trilogy. It's not a 5-book series, which I've written. I've written a trilogy. I've written a 5-book series. I've never done, and a duology, but I've never done a quartet. Why is it 4 books?
So this is originally I did want it to be a trilogy because I've written trilogies before, and it's obviously 3 is a nice round number. But when I was really breaking down what needed to happen in the subsequent books, I realized that if I tried to make it a trilogy, it would all be too much. And if I tried to stretch it out into 5, it would be, to quote Bilbo Baggins, like butter scraped over too much bread. So I just thought 4 is a little bit of an odd number, but I
Actually, it's an
think
even number, but yes.
yeah, well, yeah. but I did think it's the best way to tell the story without cramming everything in too much or overstretching it unnecessarily. Because one of the main things that I always ask myself in regards to anything to do with the writing process is how necessary is this? What are the necessities? And sometimes it does make me roll my eyes a little bit because it makes life a bit more difficult for myself. But if it makes things easier for the reader, then that's ultimately the most important thing.
So the second book is called Run Like Clockwork. Is that in the same series, or is that something else?
No, that's the another series.
Oh,
That
another
one,
series.
another series. Yeah, I've got quite a few. So that's at its core, that's a duology, which came out in 20. I'm losing track of the years now. This is what COVID's done to me. It's
Yeah.
made me lose track of all the years. But that came out a couple of years ago, 2022. Um, and that's, like I say, 2 books, but I'm currently expanding it this year, just expanding the universe with some prequel short stories, which are coming out on my website free, so anyone can read those. And there will be a prequel novel coming out, hopefully sometime next year.
So that's what you're working on now?
I'm currently finishing up the last round of drafting on the final Nightland Quartet book. But as soon as that one's finished, it's right back into the world of Run Like Clockwork, which is going to be quite jarring, actually, because the Nightland Quartet, of course, takes place in what is essentially a giant, dark, enchanted forest. So there's trees everywhere. In the world of Run Like Clockwork, the world is so polluted and damaged that trees can't even grow. So it's a little bit of a difference to be going from one world to another.
You've written a lot of short stories, and you just mentioned some there. Do you think which do you prefer, novels or short stories? Most authors seem to be gravitate to one or the other.
Mm. I mean, I think it really depends on what story I'm telling, because again, it all comes down to that necessity, whether a story needs to be novel sized or whether it doesn't. I do love the complete and utter immersion that comes with writing a novel. Because I love writing so much. I love to really feel like it's swallowing me up in a sense, and that I'm really living it with the characters. And novels really give me the opportunity to do that because they take so much longer to produce. But there's something quite nice about writing a short story that's quick and hits all the same structural beats as a novel, but in a much shorter time. But at the same time, you try and still wring the same amount of emotion and response out of it. It can be a bit of a challenge, but it also helps to, I think, keep me sharp. So it's nice to gravitate towards one for one thing and one for another.
There's a writing exercise that I picked up from James Van Pelt, who's a very well-known science fiction writer and who specializes in short stories. He's also a former high school teacher. And he has something called the 7-sentence short story, which is a plotting exercise that produces a complete short story in 7 sentences. It's you introduce the character what he wants in the first sentence, and he takes his first action to try to achieve that. The second one, you get the result of the action, and he's further away from his goal than he was. Third sentence, he takes another action. Fourth sentence, he's further away from the goal again. Fifth sentence, he takes a final action. Sixth sentence, he either succeeds or fails. Seventh sentence, denouement, and there's some sort of however you want to wrap it up. So I've done it a number of times, and it is really quite a useful way to create something very quickly and get that satisfaction of having hit all the beats. Now,
Yeah.
I admit that things like semicolons and dashes and colons are very helpful because I end up writing 150-word sentences sometimes. But so the punctuation can be creative.
Yeah.
Now, where can people find you online?
So I am on all of the typical social media platforms. I'm on Facebook. I also have a readers group on Facebook called the Batty Brigade.
I saw that, yes.
Yeah, I love that name so much. And that's very similar to the Facebook page, but it's a way to make sure that you get all of the notifications, and I do some extra things in there as well. I'm also on Threads, Instagram and TikTok are my main places where you can find me. And the books are all available via Amazon, and some of them are also available through other retailers as well. I'm just in the process of jumping through all of the hoops necessary to make sure that they are available for wide releases as well.
Well, and I will have links to your various accounts on the web page for this interview. So
Thank you.
I think that wraps it up. So thanks so much for being on, Emma. I really enjoyed the chat. I hope you did as well.
I really did. Thank you so much for having me.
And best of luck with all your mini projects.
Thank you very much, and same to you.
And thanks again to EC, Emma, for being my guest on this episode of the Worldshapers. I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope that you did as well. That wraps up this episode. Just a few closing remarks. Again, I want to remind you of the ongoing Kickstarter. It's almost over, but it is still there. Still lots of great rewards, and it's for Shapers of Worlds Volume 5, the 5th anthology featuring science fiction and fantasy by authors who were guests on this podcast. You can find it at tinyurl.com/Shapers of Worlds 5. That's numeral 5, Shapers of Worlds 5. And just a few more reminders about the podcast itself. You can find it online at theworldshapers.com. That's where you can find all the past episodes, 160 plus of them at this point. You can find it on Facebook at The Worldshapers, and you can find it on X/Twitter at The Worldshapers. You can find me online at edwardwillett.com. You can find me on Facebook at edward.willett. You can find me on Instagram at edwardwillettauthor. You can find me on X at ewillett. And if you like, you can find me on YouTube. You very well may be on my channel right now if you're watching this video on YouTube. If you subscribe, you can be notified every time I go out for a walk around my home city of Regina, Saskatchewan. I live stream those walks and talk along the way. So it's kind of like a vlog. I do often talk about publishing and writing stuff as well as what I see on my walks. So please check that out as well. And let's see. Oh, the publishing company, Shadowpaw Press. I mentioned the Kickstarter. Shadowpaw Press is at shadowpawpress.com. You can find it on Twitter at Shadowpaw Press, on Facebook at Shadowpaw Press, and on Instagram at Shadowpaw Press. All right, I think that wraps it up. Thank you so much for taking in yet another episode of The Worldshapers. I'll be back next week with another guest, and many more guests are already lined up for the future, so I hope you will continue to follow along and enjoy these chats with authors about their latest work. That's it for this time. Bye for now.